I'm not sure if you're familiar with this cartoon, but it's a good example of bias. And that's what we'll be talking about for the first half of this lecture. When we think about what ELLs experience, they all bring different skills with them, but we expect them to all reach a certain skill set regardless of the skills that they provide. So the first half of the lecture, we're talking about test bias, and then in the last half, we'll talk about assessment for English language, specifically in Missouri. So we're talking about test bias this week. I've included this link in the module already. It's the Good Times clip from 1974. Take the time to look at it. It's just a couple minutes long, but it gives a good example of how students who are, for example, urban African Americans may experience bias when tests are made by people who are not urban black Americans. This video has also been provided in the module. It's looking at how students in Australia, both white Anglo students and Aboriginal students, perform on different kinds of tests. And the cultural experiences that students have definitely shape what they are able to do and what they consider normal. It's very interesting when you look at this clip of the skills that Aboriginal students have that they think are just normal skills. They don't think they're special, but our Anglo-speaking students don't have those skills. So it's very interesting to look at and to think about, do we look at the assets our students bring to the classroom, all of those assets, including ones that aren't necessarily ones that have been built up in our own cultures. So when we think about culture, that can refer to food and dress and many other things. But cultural bias is the extent to which an assessment offends, limits, or penalizes a student based on their cultural background. And I think it's very fair to say that there's no way to completely eliminate cultural bias from an assessment. Every assessment is going to have some cultural bias in it. We can reduce cultural bias to an extent. Construct bias is something that occurs when the types of questions we ask, the content of the questions we ask, do not line up with what students have experienced to be able to be assessed for. So, for example, if we have an IQ test that we are trying to give to an ELL student, but the test is completely in English and they don't speak English at all or very strongly, are we assessing their IQ or are we assessing their English ability? The method a test is given can provide bias as well. Methods are culturally driven. So in the United States, we are used to lengthy tests that may be multiple choice, such as an SAT. The setting where the test occurs, how much assistance is provided, could be very, very different than the classroom culture that students from other countries may experience. Many ELLs will have little to no experience with standardized tests, or the tests they have taken, procedures may be very different. So again, there's a lack of alignment between what students have experience with and what the test is asking them to do. In this instance, and with the other areas of bias, students will not perform as well because they're not prepared. One thing that we can do is teach students Western forms of testing. And when I say Western, I mean Western Europe and the United States. So we can teach them how to be prepared for the test that they will experience. As you approach instruction and assessment in your own classroom, here are several things to avoid. Don't use idioms. He or she is hot. That's cool. They're on top of things today. Students will take those things very literally if they're new to learning English. Use words that go together, collocates. Set the table, keep track, take a test, make your bed, have a cold. These words don't necessarily go together except in expressions that we understand because they're expressions. We've already talked about phrasal verbs. Take off has multiple meanings. Is it a plane taking off? Are you taking a shirt off? Are you leaving? Don't assume that ELLs understand instructions or directions that typical American students would. And don't assume that they have experience with the test style, like we just mentioned. Provide as many opportunities as possible for students to experience that test style. Well, we can't eliminate bias completely. We should try to limit it as much as possible. So we talked about things not to do. These are things that we can do. Use a variety of assessments. Portfolios show what students can do across multiple settings, multiple prompts. So portfolios can be very helpful. Monitor students' responses to various assessments. What types of questions tend to work well? What ones might they need more help with? Make assessments culturally inclusive. For example, use students' names on their tests, or include readings about students' own cultures in their assessments. We talked before about providing comprehensible input. Modify tests for students so that they are more comprehensible. Providing extra time is typically a given for ELL students. However, a caveat, if students don't know words, sometimes providing extra time can just make them more frustrated because it's just more time that they don't know something. So after you've given sufficient time and students seem like they have given the effort that they can, sometimes it's okay to say you've done all you can do for today. Document students' progress in all 4 language domains. As you speak directions, also read and write them. And as we mentioned before, expose students to standardized tests by practicing those test patterns. This slide shows an arrow for how we identify students who are potential English language learners, how we assess them each year looking for growth in their language, and then an ability to exit them from ESL once they have shown a high level of English proficiency. When a student comes to a school district, typically at enrollment, they fill out what is called a language use survey. This survey asks what language does the student understand and what language does the student speak. If the student speaks or understands a language other than English, they must take the WIDA screener. And the results of the WIDA screener determine if they qualify for ESL services. WIDA is the name of the consortium of over 30 states that use the same assessment battery, which includes both the screener used once to identify students initially And then also the test given every January or sometimes February called the Access for ELLs. If a student scores 4.7 or higher on the Access for ELLs, they can exit from ESL services and move to monitor status, which lasts for 2 years. During those 2 years, we're not providing services for them, but we are checking on them to make sure that they are successful. This slide shows the 6 levels of English language proficiency according to the WIDA scale. As I said, 4.7 is the score required to exit in the state of Missouri. So typically, we do not have students at levels 5 and 6 in our ESL programs. So the 4 domains, again, that we assess students in are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Students may grow at different rates in each domain, but there should be a general trend towards moving to a higher proficiency level. Again, level 1 is entering with no English skills to 4.7 is where we exit them from ESL services. Because students are assessed in all of these content areas across all grades, it's important that we teach both language and content together. So we're not just working on social language first, we're working as much as students are able to do on content area language as a vehicle to help students learn the content as well as English. These last few slides are strategies for assessing. I'm not going to read them to you, so it'd be good for you to download the version with no audio. Think about which strategies would be most successful for the grade levels you work with, for the students you might experience, and process that as you look at the discussion board questions talking about bias.